Hello, Israel. It's Red Planet again, coming to you with another video. We're gonna listen to this young man speak about multi wives, and he's reading from the book of Jasher. Let's get to it because he is saying some pretty interesting things I did not know, and quite sure Israel you didn't know either. So let's get to it. Let's see what he got to say.
In the Western world, and Babylon is definitely not living by this. So if this applies to you, and it used to apply to me too. Once you come into the full truth about keeping the commandments, just stop doing that. Don't sleep around. All right, Deuteronomy 22, verses 28 through 29. It reads, "If a man find a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed," and betrothed just means espoused. It's the same thing as being engaged. And lay hold on her and lie with her, and they be found. Then the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he hath humbled her. He may not put her away all his days. So this is basically saying, if a man sees a woman and she's a virgin and she's not engaged to somebody else, and he lies with her, then he's supposed to marry her. So back in the day, back in biblical times, the appropriate protocol would have been you approach the woman's family, the father, you ask permission to marry her. They have the father gives you permission. You might give the father something for the family for marrying her, and then there would be a feast, and then you go and consummate the marriage, and then you're married. And this is specifically talking about if you didn't take that route. Say you just saw her and y'all decided to sleep with each other back in the day, back in Bible times. This was Moses talking. Then you were supposed to marry her after you slept with her. Another key thing to pick up here is because there's Israelites running around talking about Jesus was not born of a virgin, that Joseph was the
Mr.
father,
J.
even though it says that Joseph did not know Mary, which is the same thing as meaning he didn't sleep with her. And they get this whole espoused and betrothed thing confused. Well, to clear that up for you, if you go up to, in this same chapter, if you go up to verse 23, if a damsel that is a virgin be betrothed unto a husband. So this betrothed, we're finding out here that this means engaged. And virgin means what it always means, like she hasn't slept with anybody. It doesn't just mean a young woman, it means a woman who hasn't slept with somebody. If a damsel that is a virgin be betrothed unto a husband, and a man find her in the city and lie with her, then ye shall bring them both out unto the gate of that city, and you shall stone them with stones that they die. The damsel, because she cried not, being in the city, and the man, because he hath humbled his neighbor's wife. So thou shalt put away evil from among you. And this is basically talking about if the man forced himself on the woman and they were in the city, if the man really forced himself on the woman, then the woman should have screamed, and then someone back in those days, because of the close quarters that you lived in, somebody would have heard her screaming and came to her defense. But if she didn't scream, it must have been mutual. And even though she was a virgin, she was still engaged to a husband, but they hadn't consummated the marriage yet. Example of this, if you remember, Jacob worked 7 years initially for Rachel, but it turned out being Leah. Then he had to work another 7 years to get Rachel. So he was betrothed to Rachel for 14 years, but didn't consummate the marriage till 14 years later. Anyways, the point is with this is when it says Joseph and Mary were betrothed or espoused to each other, Mary was still a virgin. They hadn't consummated the marriage yet when Mary got pregnant. Therefore, it was a virgin birth. Okay? All right. Let's move on to the next point. With this, God's original intent was for one man and one wife. Okay? Remember, we're dealing here with multiple wives. So we've already established that if a man slept with a woman, that they were supposed to get married under all circumstances. Anytime a man slept with a woman, according to the Bible, the man was supposed to marry that woman. So God's original intent was for one man and one wife, i.e. Adam and Eve. Knowing mankind in its sinful state would not abide by his commandments, certain allowances were made by Moses and allowed by God. So if you were married and desired another unmarried woman, you had to marry her. You had to marry her also if you slept with her. Okay? So this is like you're already married, and then for whatever reason you see another woman who's not married, because if she was married, that's adultery and y'all both would be stoned. But if you're already married and you see another woman who's a virgin and you slept with her, you were supposed to marry her. You couldn't just sleep with her because if once you slept with her, you've defiled her and she's polluted. I covered that in my last lesson about divorce and stuff. Okay? All right? So let's get the precepts for that. Exodus, and like I said, I'm trying to run through this really quickly because I want to get through with this as quickly as possible. I got another lesson dealing with the history of the Israelites, the history of the Hamites, of all the different Hamite groups, and how the Israelites ended up in the sub-Saharan Africa, all the different Hamite groups up in sub-Saharan Africa, and how we ended up there, and even stuff dealing with Asia and the Table of Nations is a big lesson. I'm trying to work on that. So I'm trying to get through this really, really quick. And I'm only doing this lesson because, like I said, this issue has been coming up repeatedly with people, I want to call them sons of Belial, who want to have all these wives, not really focusing on scripture, just want women. And then this book of Jasher thing just constantly coming up, so I just want to clear it up. All right, so another precepts for what we just went over, Exodus 21 and 10. I'm going to turn there really fast. All right. Exodus 21 and 10. And this is Moses again. It says, if he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. So this is just basically showing where Moses gave the allowance if you take another wife, how you're supposed to treat that wife. All right, we're going to go to Deuteronomy 21:15. It's going to be the same thing. All right, Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 15 reads, if a man have two wives, one beloved and another hated, and they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated, and if the firstborn son be hers that was hated, then it shall be when he maketh his sons to inherit that which he hath, that he may not make the son of the beloved firstborn before the son of the hated, which is indeed the firstborn. So basically here, once again, same thing. Moses is saying if a man ends up having two wives or more than one wife, that you're not supposed to cheat if the firstborn is of the wife that you don't like anymore. This is all going to my main point of where I'm going to show scripturally you're not supposed to have more than one wife. But this is still going to the point of why would you want more than one wife? Because every example in the Bible is negative of people having more than one wife. But it says here, if you end up hating one of the other wives and she bears you your firstborn son, you can't cheat that son and that wife out of that inheritance, of the firstborn's inheritance. So this is a couple scriptures where Moses is giving the allowance for if you end up having more than one wife, which once again, we've established that if a man slept with a woman, he was supposed to marry her. So therefore, if you were already married and for whatever reason you slept with another woman who was a virgin, and wasn't married, you were supposed to marry her. So we don't live like that today in Babylon, but it would be like today here in Babylon. If you were married and then you saw another girl and you ended up sleeping with her, instead of it just being like, oh, I cheated on my wife and now your wife is mad and doesn't want to be with you. Nope, you just got you another wife. And that woman's family would make sure you married her. Okay? All right, but just to give you an example of how in the Bible of allowances being made really quickly, keep your finger here in Deuteronomy 21 and then turn over to Deuteronomy 7, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 6 really quick. I'm going to show you how these are another example of what God will tell you a commandment, but then because he knows man is going to screw it up, allowances are made for your screw up, okay, to correct your screw ups. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and have cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites and the Girgasites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Those are all Canaanites. Those are all Hamites. Those are all black nations. 7 nations, look it up, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them, neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. I'm going to repeat that. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and destroy thee suddenly. 5. But thus shall ye deal with them. Ye shall destroy their altars, and break down their images, and cut down their groves, and burn down their graven images with fire. For thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth. Something to remember, Israelites. We're not talking spiritual, metaphorical stuff. God's pretty clear. He put the Israelites above all people on the face of the earth. Don't get mad at me. I'm just reading the book, okay? All right, so now, that was pretty clear that the Israelites were not supposed to marry any of the women that they encountered in the land that they were coming to conquer, the land of Israel or Palestine. They weren't supposed to marry any of those Canaanite women. That's what Moses told them. That was a commandment from God. We just read that, Deuteronomy chapter 7. Now, if you turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 21, and you look at verses 10 through 13, you're going to find out here's an exception. We just read that you're not supposed to marry those women. But we read here in chapter 21, verse 10, when thou goest forth to war against thine enemies, and the Lord thy God hath delivered them into thine hand, and thou hast taken them captive, and seest amongst the captives a beautiful woman, and hast a desire unto her, that thou wouldest have her to thy wife, then thou shalt bring her home to thine house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and she shall put the raiment of her captivity from off her, and shall remain in thine house, and bewail her father and her mother a full month. And after that thou shalt go in unto her, and be her husband, and she shall be thy wife. So you notice one right there at the end, she wasn't your wife until you went in unto her. While she was bewailing that month, she wasn't your wife till you consummated the marriage. Number 2, though, you see here is in the same book, Moses is saying, when you conquer these people, and you see a beautiful woman and you take one and you marry her, this is what you're supposed to do. But we just read in Deuteronomy chapter 7 that the Israelites were not supposed to take any of those women as their wives. So clearly what you're seeing here is God gave the commandment for them not to do that. But then the people did it anyway. They still married the women that they weren't supposed to marry anyway. And that being the case, there had to have been made an allowance because he knew that the people were going to sin and not keep his word and marry women that they weren't supposed to marry. So then Moses is covering that, okay? All right, so that's the principle behind that was the same thing with the multiple wives. God did not want you to marry multiple wives. He only wanted you to have one wife. If you slept with another woman, now guess what? You have another wife. Pretty clear to understand, but we're going to go into this a little bit deeper. Really quick though, with the marrying the other women of the foreign nations, interracial marriage or marrying a woman or marrying a person of the opposite quote unquote race that's not technically a sin. That's not what this is really about. What it's really about is if you're marrying these people and they don't keep the commandments, they don't follow the Israelites' religion, which was the Bible. And now it would be the same equivalent as Christianity, following the Bible, keeping the commandments. You marry someone of a foreign culture, they have their own foreign religion, they might turn you towards it. So for example, if you're an Israelite, you shouldn't marry an Indian who's a Hindu because they might turn you towards Hinduism. So you shouldn't do that. Okay? So that's what that's dealing with. But overall, I would recommend it's best to stay amongst your own culture. He created us that way for a reason. Okay? We're going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so Does God condone multiple wives? Let's get some precepts for this. Deuteronomy 17, 15 through 17. And remember, the definition of multiply or multiple means increase or cause to increase greatly in number or quantity. Increase or cause to increase greatly in number or quantity. So, multiple means more than one. That's what multiple means. Keep that in mind as we read Deuteronomy 17, 15 through 17. Okay? Deuteronomy 17, 15 through 17 reads, Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Side note, God was telling the Israelites, you don't make somebody king over you who's not of you. You might want to apply that today as a people because we have a lot of stuff that happens to us as a people. Who are you voting for? Who are you putting in charge over you? I'll use Memphis as an example. You got the guy, what's his name, Cohen, who's the congressman over you, who's an Edomite, a fake Jew. He's not black, even though the Congress district is overwhelmingly black. But because the people are Democrats and they just vote for who the Democrat incumbent is, this guy can't get out. Scripture says you should not put somebody over you who's not your brother, Israelites. You might want to remember that. Okay? And then wondering why stuff is going on that you don't like in your community. And I know that you can put some of your own in power and they can be bad, but you need to put somebody of your own in power over you who keeps the commandments. Okay? All right, so let's start this over. Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt. And our people have a bad problem with that. All the Afrocentric, Kemetic stuff, a lot of us, we just love Egypt. But in that lesson I was telling you about that I'm preparing to do, we're going to cover all of that, okay, with history. To the end that he should multiply horses for as much as the Lord hath said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. So right here, the commandment was to not multiply wives, which means to have more than one wife, because it's going to turn your heart away from God. That is a common thread throughout the Bible. The more wives you have, the more likely it is your heart is going to be turned away from God. Okay? All right. Move on to the next scripture. Matthew 19 and somebody else. All right? Isaac didn't marry a second wife. He was only married to Rachel. The next patriarch, our father Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, if you remember, Jacob only wanted to marry Rachel. He didn't want to marry Leah. And so he came to marry Rachel from his own family, Laban. And Laban tricked him. And for you people, like, how could Jacob go in and sleep with a woman and not know that it was Leah and not Rachel? First of all, when they were consummating the marriage, it was usually a large feast and people drunk and got drunk. Okay, they drank. There was a lot of wine, a lot of what they call strong drink. That's what they used to do back in the day. And another thing, when you went into the tent, usually the first time culturally, they have some historical context, the woman's face was usually covered. Like they usually had a veil over it. So that is how this could potentially happen. Plus they're sisters, they probably looked alike, but that's not the point of this. So the point is he ends up sleeping with Leah. Guess what? He's got a wife. Jacob didn't want to marry Leah, right? But because if you sleep with the woman, you got to marry her. And definitely her father wasn't going to allow him to be like, even though he's the one who tricked him, to be like, oh, you can't marry, you can get away with not marrying Leah. No, you've slept with her, you've defiled her. If you were to do that now and send her off, she's been polluted. So what did Jacob have to do? He ended up having to work another 7 years in order to get Rachel. Okay? Once he ends up with Rachel and Leah, Leah and Rachel compete amongst each other to see who can have the most children. And then even at one point, Jacob gets prostituted because he gets sold for the children's mandrakes. Like Leah hadn't been able to go in onto Jacob for a long time, and so Leah was like, I'll give you some of my children's mandrakes if you let me be able to sleep with Jacob. Anyways, point is, a whole hot mess, not a good example of having multiple wives. It wasn't a hot look for Jacob. God bless Jacob, and Rachel and Leah, because those are, and in their handmaidens that also produce children, or we want to end up with the 12 tribes of Israel. And, I wouldn't be here today, but I mean, it is what it is. Next example, Gideon. In Judges, it says Gideon had many wives. It doesn't even tell you how many wives he had. It just says he had many wives. And then he ended up having 70 sons by his wives, plus Abimelech. And Abimelech was the wife that he had by his concubine. Same thing, you end up having family beef between the concubine and the children of the other wives. And guess what happened? Abimelech killed all 70 of his brothers. Okay? Another bad example of having multiple wives. I'm going to keep going because there's not a good example you're going to find in the book of having multiple wives. The prophet Samuel. If you remember the prophet Samuel, his mom dedicated Samuel to the Lord. So that's why Samuel had to serve with the priests and all of that. And that's how Samuel ended up getting his job. But anyways, the point is, even in that case, Samuel's father had 2 wives, but the second wife mocked Samuel's mom and made Samuel's mom sad. And that's why Samuel's mom went and prayed before the priest where the tabernacle was and asked God to bless her with a child. And if you give me a child, I'll dedicate him to you. Because she couldn't have a child and she was tired of the other wife always poking fun at her. And then Samuel's father was even like, is not my love enough for you? Like Samuel's father loved her so much that he was like, even though you haven't produced me a child, I still love you. Is that not enough? Is my love not enough for you? Just a whole lot of drama in the household that I'm like, why would any man in his right mind choose to put himself in that situation just so you can have more women to sleep with? Come on, bruh. All right. Let's look at the kings. Look at King David. King David had multiple wives, and his thirst for wives ended up costing him because he ended up committing adultery, sleeping with another man's wife, Bathsheba, and it ended up causing a whole lot of problems. Okay, like he ended up impregnating Bathsheba, and because of his sin, because the wages of sin is death, and technically, this is an example of grace though too. So don't beat yourself up, because technically King David should have been killed for committing adultery according to the law. But what ended up happening was Bathsheba got pregnant, and the first child that David had with Bathsheba ended up dying within the first week of his infancy. So that was his punishment for doing that. Okay. And then if you remember, David connived and ended up having her husband killed. Once again, another hot mess. Okay. Next example, King Solomon. King Solomon had thousands of wives. Okay. And we saw how that turned out. That's how we end up with the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. That's how you end up with Judah and in the kingdom of Israel. And that's how the kingdom split, because Solomon had so many wives. And then we like to praise Solomon for his wisdom and how righteous he was. But we often forget that at the end of his reign, he started building altars to pagan gods because of his foreign wives and his many wives. He started building pagan altars. Okay? So the point is, there aren't any positive examples in the Bible of multiple wives. So the bottom line is you should stay away from that. It's not a hot look. And the sun stood still and the moon stayed until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and hasted not to go down about a whole day. So it says here, is this not written in the book of Jasher? Well, what was not written in the book? What is written in the book of Jasher? Let's go up to verse 5 and see what was going on to get some context. Okay? Starting at verse 5. Therefore, the 5 kings of the Amorites, remember this, therefore the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, because at that time the Israelites had just come into Canaan and the Canaanites were ruling Israel, the different Canaanite groups. And for more, if you want to learn about the Canaanites outside of the Bible and you want it from a historical context, just read about the Phoenicians. That's who the Canaanites were. Phoenicians and Canaanites are one and the same thing. The Amorites were just one band of Canaanites, but at the time they were ruling Jerusalem. Okay, starting back at verse 5. Therefore, the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered themselves together and went up, they and all their hosts, and encamped before Gibeon, and made war against it. And the men of Gibeon sent unto Joshua to the camp of Gilgal, saying, Slack not thy hand from thy servants, come up to us quickly, and save us and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites that dwell in the mountains are gathered together against us. So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. And the Lord said unto Joshua, Fear them not, for I have delivered them into thine hand. There shall not a man of them stand before thee. Joshua therefore came unto them suddenly, and went up from Gilgal all night. And the Lord discomfited them before Israel, and slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon. Notice it says the Lord slew them, because the Lord is a man of war. Stop letting these people tell you he's a fluffy duffy. There's times for war and there's times for peace. And our God is a peaceful God, but then there's also times where he's a wrathful God, and God will fight your causes for you. If you need something done and you need somebody to fight for you, instead of taking it in your own hands, take it to God and let God fight for you. Okay? Anyway, and it says, And the Lord discomfited them before Israel, and slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and chased them along the way that goeth up to Beth Horon, and smote them at Azekah and unto Makkedah. And it came to pass, as they fled from before Israel, and were in the going down to Beth Horon, that the Lord cast down great stones from heaven upon them unto Azekah, and they died. They were more which died with hailstones than they whom the children of Israel slew with the sword. Then spake Joshua to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before. And like I say, I always say, if you have questions, don't feel free to comment or message me on here. And some of you who hear this, you personally know me. If you have questions, just ask. And if you have any Bible questions, just ask me. And
Okay, Israel. So you know what to do. Shalom.